Every house in Britain has a story to tell, but in this series, we're going to uncover the secret life of just one. A Victorian house here in Leeds, a city whose factories and workshops in the 19th century made Britain into an industrial superpower. Delving into the archives, I'll uncover the hidden histories of the residents of this house to tell epic stories that span 150 years. Stories of love and scandal, grief and glamour, and fortunes made and lost. His left arm had been cut off. The poor fellow died in 5 minutes. He has a nude woman tattooed on the inside of his left forearm.
He was this lad from Leeds, suddenly mixing with the most swish people in the universe.
This looks really suspicious.
It's dodgy, isn't it?
The circumstances strongly suggested that she'd been poisoned.
What a time we had here. I'm really emotional right now.
This is the ultimate detective hunt, uncovering lives that weren't recorded in books, but that tell us a new version of our nation's past, an alternative history of Britain contained within the walls of a single house. Today, over 750,000 people call the thriving city of Leeds home. I first got to know Leeds back in the late 90s when I was living here as a student studying journalism. These days, I come to Leeds all the time because one of my sisters lives here with her family. So it's a city I've known for much of my life. 2 miles out from the city centre is Headingley, a suburb of Victorian houses popular with locals and students. And it's here that we find number 5 Grosvenor Mount. Today, it's home to Jackie and Pete. They're both retired. Jackie from a career in finance, Pete as a teacher and engineer. The house welcomes many guests, including Jackie's sister Abby and goddaughter Sarah, who recently lived in the basement flat.
And it's been painted, but, you know, it looks lovely and I'm glad it was your home for so long.
It is.
Hello, David.
Hello.
Hello, please come in.
Thank you. Lovely to meet you. So Jackie and Pete, do you know much about the history of your house?
Well, we know it was built in the mid-19th century.
And how long have you been living here?
We moved in here in 1995, but I've known the house for much longer because my parents lived a couple of streets away, and with a school friend we used to sit on a little wall opposite and dream that one day she would have the middle house of the three and I wanted this one because that had the longest distance view.
So you've literally dreamed of living here as a child?
Yes, a true story.
Inside, the basement has been converted into a self-contained apartment for guests. On the ground floor, there's a dining room, a modern kitchen, and a spacious front room. The first floor includes 3 bedrooms and a family bathroom, with more bedrooms on the top floor. And the house also contains some intriguing clues.
There are signs in the house that there used to be servants here.
There's bell pulls on the fireplace.
Yeah, bell pulls on the fireplace, which no longer work. Somebody's inscribed something on a wall. You know, who was J. Wood? So, David, the crack above the doorway, we were quite horrified by that, but we were told that it was from some form of earthquake or something in the 1930s. We don't know if that's the case.
Earthquake damage in Leeds.
I don't know. That's one of the mysteries maybe you can solve.
When Jackie and Pete bought the house, it came with an old box of land and title deeds. They reveal that right up until the middle of the 19th century, this land was used for farming. But one document shows that in 1849, things suddenly changed. It's a deed of sale, and what it shows is that this land was being carved up into small plots that were then being sold. So something has happened. After centuries of being used for farming, this land rather suddenly has become prime real estate. Back in the late 18th century, Leeds was a town of around 15,000 people. But by the 1850s, the Industrial Revolution and later expansion had pushed the population to over 170,000. As Leeds filled up with factories, the town's middle classes started looking for fresh air. And the green fields of Headingley became a property hotspot for the Victorian elite of Leeds. In the early 1850s, the housing boom reached Grosvenor Mount. A row of 3 new properties was built, numbers 1 to 3. So our house, at the end, began life as number 3 Grosvenor Mount, only later becoming number 5. At a rent of £30 a year, it was 4 times what you'd pay for a worker's back-to-back house in Leeds. Now it was ready for its first residents. To start our investigations, I'm digging into local archives to see if birth and death registers and professional directories can tell us who first walked through the door at Grosvenor Mount. This is White's new directory of the Borough of Leeds. It's a list of professional and residential addresses. It's kind of like a phone book before there were phones. And this edition is from 1853. And the wonderful thing about it is that it can tell us the name of our very first resident. Because living at 3 Grosvenor Mount is one William Bruce. And this also tells us that he is a solicitor. Now, we tracked down William's registration of birth, and that tells us that he was 28 at the time he moved in to Grosvenor Mount. And we also found his marriage certificate. He got married in 1852 to Helen George, who was then 28 years old. And under rank or profession, this tells us that her father was a gentleman. So they're both from the same well-off middle-class background. They're newly married and they're moving into their first home together. So who were the Bruces and what had brought them to Grosvenor Mount? As a lawyer, William could afford the £30 a year it cost to rent our house. But although he came from a privileged background, newspapers reveal William was devoted to the poorest people of Leeds. This is a newspaper report of a meeting that was held in a village in West Yorkshire in 1850 of the freehold land movement. This was a reform society that wanted to make it possible for working class people to buy their own homes. And that would not just have improved their living standards, critically, it would have given them the right to vote. And one of the key speakers at this meeting, it says, is Mr. William Bruce. William is just 25 years old when this meeting takes place. This is another report of another meeting by another reform society, this time the National Public School Association. What they did was campaign for places at school, not just for the children of the rich, but for those of the poor. And this meeting, it says, was presided over by Mr. William Bruce, solicitor. So although William's still in his 20s when he moves into this house, he's already shown himself to be somebody who's deeply involved in the great Victorian reform movements. This is a man who wants to make Victorian society better and fairer. Yet buried deep in the archives, we've discovered a very different piece of evidence. One that reveals that the upright William Bruce was involved in one of the most gruesome scandals of Victorian Leeds. 4 years after William moved into Grosvenor Mount, an article appeared in a Leeds newspaper. Its subject was a 28-year-old man named William Dove, who 3 weeks earlier had been sentenced to death for murdering his wife. This is a petition, an appeal for mercy, and it's directed towards Queen Victoria, Her Most Excellent Majesty. And it concludes, "Your petitioners humbly pray that your most gracious Majesty will be pleased to spare the life of the said William Dove." And then underneath the petition is the list of the petitioners, and among them is William Bruce. So who was William Dove? And why was the socially committed William Bruce trying to save a man who had killed his own wife? 4 weeks earlier, a report had appeared in a local newspaper, the Leeds Mercury. At the beginning of March, this report tells us, the police had been called to a house in Burley, which is another Leeds suburb about a mile from here. A woman called Harriet Dove was in agony. And this report explains that her body was arched and her hands were clenched. Her body was being convulsed by spasm after spasm. And then, finally, Harriet Dove died in the greatest possible pain and agony. Now, the circumstances of Harriet Dove's death strongly suggested that she'd been poisoned. William Dove was Harriet's husband. Investigators discovered he'd recently bought a quantity of strychnine, which in the 19th century was used as rat poison. When the post-mortem revealed strychnine poisoning, William Dove was arrested for murder. His trial was a sensation. On the third day, his defense barrister produced a key piece of evidence, a letter written by Dove from prison and then later published in reports of the trial. This report explains a disturbing detail about the letter, which is that William Dove wrote it from his prison cell, not using ink, but using his own blood, because this was a letter addressed to the devil. William wrote, "Dear devil, if you will get me clear at the assizes," meaning if you will get me acquitted in court, "and let me have the enjoyment of life, health, wealth, tobacco, beer, and live till I am 60, come to me and tell me. Your faithful servant, William Dove." Suddenly, the lid was lifted on a secret world of black magic and devil worship, lurking behind the genteel windows of suburban Leeds. Dove was obsessed with spirits and had tried to stage an incantation to summon the devil. And a local man, who had declared himself a wizard, had told Dove he would not be happy until his wife was dead. Now, Dove received his sentence, death by hanging. But William Bruce and others in Leeds thought this was a miscarriage of justice. 3 weeks later, the plea for William Dove's life was published, signed by William Bruce. Harry Potter is a barrister and historian. I'm hoping he can explain why William Bruce so publicly defended a poisoner. There will be a lot of people in Leeds who look on the face of this and say, this man has killed his wife in a terrible way, and he's as guilty as sin.
Yes. This was an intention to kill. You cannot poison someone with strychnine over a period of time not intending death.
So William Bruce, what is his grounds for thinking that in the case of William Dove, the death penalty is inappropriate?
Bruce would take into account his erratic and strange behaviour, his association with wizardry and Satanism and his pact with the devil. He puts that into the balance. And on the balance, he concludes that while this man was guilty of murder and he had committed a terrible crime, he was a deeply damaged individual, not fully responsible for the actions that he had taken. And Bruce, we know, seemed to have a real humanitarian streak. I think he had a genuine human empathy.
In Victorian Britain, those condemned to hang were often reprieved at the last moment. William Bruce and his fellow campaigners published their plea on the morning of the execution. But hours later, William Dove was hanged. Press reports said a crowd of thousands watched his execution, and that then his corpse was left hanging for an hour in the rain. William Bruce had failed to save a man's life. But he continued campaigning on behalf of the poor and the vulnerable. By 1856, he and Helen had moved out of the house. Then, aged 44, his stature was recognised when he was made the first full-time paid magistrate of Leeds. And we've discovered that more than 2 decades after he left our house, a case came before Magistrate William Bruce that must have brought back painful memories. Christmas night, 1881. In a central Leeds pub, John Ross, a 27-year-old labourer, fell into a drunken argument with another young man named John Manley. Outside, it suddenly turned violent, and Ross stabbed Manley in the neck. Manley bled to death, and Ross was arrested for murder. In Leeds, murder trials took place before a senior visiting judge. But before that could happen, Ross had to appear before the magistrate, William Bruce. On the 25th of January, 1882, William Bruce was sat here, looking across his courtroom, and right there in the dock was John Ross. A Leeds court reporter sets the scene. When John Ross was placed in the dock, he had a downcast and dogged look, and he either kept his hands in his trouser pockets or he placed them on the bar of the dock. And then, when William Bruce charged Ross with the offence, and that offence was murder, Ross commenced to sob violently and pleaded not guilty, and he was then removed to the cells below the dock, weeping. As magistrate, William Bruce's part in this case was now officially over. 2 weeks later, Ross's murder trial took place before another senior judge. And there he was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. But William Bruce wasn't happy.
As a magistrate, he would deal with young men who were getting into fights all the time. He wouldn't often deal with having to commit one for murder. We know he had a great concern for the welfare of young people. We know he was actively involved in trying to assist young people who are either homeless or in trouble. And he would see in front of him not the classic Victorian tabloid murderer, but a frightened young man who, had he not been in the pub on that day, would never have ended up here. And he would see before him not wickedness, but tragedy.
William Bruce, as a young, idealistic lawyer, tried and failed to save a man's life. Now, in his 50s, he decided to try again. The man who had the final say as to whether John Ross lived or died was the Home Secretary, Sir William Harcourt. So while Ross waited for the gallows, Bruce wrote directly to Harcourt about the case. This is a copy of the handwritten letter that William Bruce wrote to the Home Secretary just 8 days after John Ross had been sentenced to death. Sir, I have the honour to write to you in reference to the case of John Ross, who was convicted of murder and now lies under sentence of death. I hope you will not think me impertinent in joining in the prayer that the mercy of the Crown may be extended to the convict. And he signs, your most obedient servant, William Bruce. Bruce wasn't the only one calling for the sentence to be overturned, but we know that his letter got Harcourt's attention. The letter that William Bruce sent to the Home Secretary came wrapped in a piece of paper, and this is a copy of it. And written on the back, we think by a civil servant at the Home Office, it says, Stipendiary Magistrate for Leeds, that's William, joins in the petition. And opposite that is the writing of the Home Secretary himself. And this is his decision in the case. And he signed it WVH, William Vernon Harcourt. And what he says is commute to penal servitude for life. And what that means is that John Ross will not be sent to the gallows. William Bruce continued to serve as a magistrate for another 12 years, working to make the Victorian justice system fairer for all ranks of society. He died aged 69 after a quarter of a century at his post. He'd earned his own portrait, which means I finally get to see him face to face. There were lots of people in the Britain of the 19th century like William Bruce. These were people who never became famous. There aren't statues to them or streets named after them, but they were the people who brought about change in their society, who understood that change was possible, but that it wasn't inevitable, that it had to be fought for, and that fight demanded lifelong commitment. For William Bruce, the urge to bring about change shaped his entire life. And at 69, he was still fighting for change with the same level of commitment that he'd shown 4 decades earlier when he'd first set foot in our house at Grosvenor Mount. By the time William moved out, Headingley had been transformed. The former farmland was now a fashionable suburb for the middle classes. And 3 Grosvenor Mount was ready for its next residents. This is a copy of a page from the Post Office Directory for the year 1857. And if we look up our house, under Grosvenor Mount, we see the name of our next resident, and that is one Rhodes Dawson. So we looked up his marriage certificate, and that tells us that 5 years earlier he'd got married to a woman called Anne, and then that led us to the birth certificates for their 2 children. There's Emily, who was 4, and little Elizabeth, who's just 2 years old. So this is a young family just starting out in life. What sort of people were the Dawsons? The first clue is the Esquire, after Rhodes Dawson's name, which suggests middle-class respectability. He came from a successful family and worked in one of the most important industries in Leeds. For centuries, the sheep farms of Yorkshire had helped make Leeds a capital of the British wool trade. By the 1850s, over 40,000 people worked across hundreds of factories and workshops. Rhodes Dawson's business was cloth dressing. Dressers turned woven cloth into a smooth, well-finished product, making it far more valuable. Before moving into our house, Rhodes and Anne had been living with his parents in Park Square in the centre of Leeds, the same square William Bruce had grown up in. So far, the Dawsons look just as middle class as the Bruces, their predecessors in the house. But we've found one document about Anne's origins that doesn't fit with that picture. This is a page from the census of 1841, and here is an entry for Anne Dawson, then Anne Jackson. She was 17 at the time. And under profession, trade or employment, this tells us that Anne, like her sister, was working as a reeler. Now, that is an unskilled job in a textile factory. This entry also tells us that her mother was working, she was a nurse, and there's no sign of a father. So the question is, how is it that a woman who at 17 had been a factory worker is now moving into this house in a posh neighbourhood of Leeds? How has she been able to so completely transform her position within Victorian society? To understand where Anne came from and how she might have got to our house, I'm meeting historian Jill Cookson. The census tells us that Anne was a reeler. What's that job?
It was a job usually done by children or young women. It was general keeping up with the machine as it ran, looking out for broken threads and fixing them, also changing bobbins at either end of the machine. And all of this was done while the machine was running. So you had to be quite nimble as well. She could have been there since she was a child. An awful lot of the child labour was from households whose heads were women, so presumably widows. Any sort of job would not pay enough for a woman to pay the rent and pay the bills.
So they had to send their children out to work.
Children had to be out at work as soon as they could. It was very dangerous. They were cleaning underneath moving machinery.
The thought of a child, a 9-year-old or a 10-year-old, in there amongst that machinery is just chilling. And that was normal.
Yeah. And they had, I mean, especially young women had long hair, long skirts, and, you know, got caught up in the transmission systems or whatever. It's horrifying.
We don't know when Anne started working in the mill, but we have tracked down her next appearance in the records. Anne was getting married, but not to Rhodes Dawson. She's aged 22. This is her maiden name, Jackson, and her new husband is John Massey, who is an iron merchant. And now that Anne is married, she would have probably been able to give up work and set up a new home with her new husband. But we also found this document. It's from just 1 year later, and it is a death certificate for John Massey. And what it tells us is that he died of the disease that our Victorian ancestors feared more than any other. He died of cholera. Now, one of the things that made cholera so incredibly frightening was the speed at which it could kill. And the registrar who has filled out this death certificate tells us that John Massey died of Asiatic cholera within just 16 hours. And what that means for Anne is that her new life with her new husband has been brought to an end within the space of just 1 day. It looked like the freedom Anne had won when she'd escaped the factory was slipping away. But an extraordinary document, which survived in the archives by chance, reveals something very different. This is a page, or more accurately, it's part of a page from the census of 1851. This document was damaged by a flood in the archive, and the whole top of it has just rotted away, leaving just the last few lines. But there's a detail here which is key to understanding Anne's story. Here she is, Anne Massey. She is listed as a widow, but she's also listed here as being the head of a household. And under occupation, it describes her as a fund holder. Now that means she had independent means. Now, because John died of cholera so horribly rapidly, there just wasn't time for him to have written a will. But it's clear from the census that he was able to leave Anne enough money to live on. So although she's been through a terrible tragedy, she has been able to rise up a little within Victorian society. At some point over the next 2 years, Anne met Rhodes Dawson. He was 24 years old and the up-and-coming son of a prosperous family. So after losing her first husband, she now has a new life. And the symbol of that new life and all the stability and respectability that comes with it is a new home. When Anne Dawson walks through that front door and into this hallway for the first time, she's still only 30. And yet this is a woman who has been married and widowed, who's known poverty, who's worked in a cotton mill, and who's watched her husband die of a terrible disease. But now she's remarried. She's part of a wealthy family. And she arrives here in her new home. This beautiful house in a posh suburb. For her, this is a new beginning. Anne's new home had ample room for her family. The basement would have housed the kitchen, pantry, and scullery. The front room would have been a spacious drawing room for entertaining guests, with a dining room and morning room at the rear of the ground floor. Upstairs, Anne and Rhodes would have had a bedroom with a smaller dressing room attached, and bedrooms for their girls. In the attic would have been more bedrooms, most likely for servants. And for the first time, we've got an idea about how the inside of the house would have looked. Design historian Professor Deborah Sugg-Ryan is exploring an auction list of items owned by Rhodes and Anne.
What I've got here gives us a real peek inside Anne and Rhodes' house because it lists all their furniture, all their furnishings. It tells us room by room about what they had. The list starts with a rosewood drawing room suite, and then in capital letters, because it's so important, a handsome Spanish mahogany sideboard, like this. Spanish mahogany comes from the West Indies, and it's the best quality mahogany that you can buy. And as an aspiring businessman, Rhodes Dawson would have been really keen to show off his status. So it talks about the fact that they have paintings and engravings. They don't just have prints. What they have is oil paintings. So this is a unique, original work of art, a real sign of status. They were clearly spending a lot of cash kitting out their house. Every surface covered with ornaments, it just makes me think of the dusting. We know from census records that the Dawsons had 2 servants. So I really wonder what it must have felt like for Anne to take on this role of mistress of the house in charge of 2 servants, because she wasn't brought up into this world. She didn't learn this from her mother. Women like her, if anything, were brought up to be servants. This must have cost a fortune. But this isn't aristocratic taste or even upper middle class taste. This is new money, and this is these new self-made middle classes who seem a little bit brash. They are saying, look at us, we've made it.
But while Anne and Rhodes were living in luxury in Headingley, down the hill in industrial Leeds, things were changing. By the 1850s, enormous factories were making life harder for smaller, independent cloth finishing firms. Firms like the Dawsons.
So at this point in Leeds, a lot of the woolens were integrated in factories, and that applied to the finishing processes. So someone in the Dawsons' position, I think, would be really scrambling around trying to get work from other people.
So the world is moving towards big factories that do the whole process themselves. And the Dawson family are sort of maybe trapped in a sort of earlier age when there was lots of specialist firms. So they're kind of behind the curve.
Exactly, exactly.
But if times were hard, there is no sign that the Dawsons' spending spree had stopped. By 1866, they'd moved into another big house in Headingley, which they filled with their fancy items from mahogany bedroom furniture to a rosewood piano. The records don't tell us if Anne was the biggest spender or if it was Rhodes. But we've discovered reports that give us a glimpse into Rhodes Dawson's true financial situation.
He was owed quite a large amount in rent, and it was 3 years in arrears.
But money that's owed to him, he's not collecting. He's allowed it to get 3 years in arrears.
He has allowed it to go a long way past where it should have been.
It doesn't seem like someone who's kind of got a sort of eagle eye on his business and watching the bottom line.
No.
Then comes another piece of evidence, the detailed list of the couple's extravagant possessions. This is how we know exactly what they'd been buying, because, rather suddenly, it was all being sold. The reason that we have this list is because it appeared in a newspaper. And that was because, as it says here, Mr. Rhodes Dawson had instructed his agents to sell all of these goods by auction. Why were the Dawsons suddenly selling off all the luxurious goods they'd acquired? 4 months later, we get an answer. Rhodes Dawson's name appears on a dreaded and very public list. In today's money, his debts were over £300,000. How had Rhodes built up such a staggering debt? Until now, he'd been able to keep his affairs private. But now he's bankrupt, they are laid bare for all to see.
So here from the Leeds Bankruptcy Court, the bankrupt expended £800 shortly before his bankruptcy.
So he spent £800 on the eve of his bankruptcy?
Yeah, and it gives a little bit of detail that in 4 months, 5 months, he'd spent £360, 2 shillings and 11pence in travelling and other personal expenses.
Personal expenses?
Yeah.
That's quite a spending spree.
Yes.
That's tens of thousands of pounds.
He'd spent a lot of money on furniture and all kinds of personal things, just as he was coming up to being bankrupt. And
but the idea that, you know, that your world's about to crash down and you go out and buy loads of furniture.
I mean,
if I thought it was all over, I wouldn't go to IKEA for a last kind of blowout.
No. It's about keeping up appearances, isn't it? And one thing you can say for the Victorians is they like keeping up appearances.
For Rhodes and Anne Dawson, number 3 Grosvenor Mount was supposed to showcase their wealth and status. Instead, it became an extravagance that pushed them towards ruin. This is a woman who's kind of dragged herself out of poverty, who's worked on the floor of a cotton mill and had managed to sort of get all of this respectability and status and comfort, and must have thought that she turned her life around And now all of that and all of this furniture, all these luxuries, all of that's going to be sold to pay creditors. So she's kind of back where she started.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah.
Anne and Rhodes Dawson left Leeds for Sheffield. Over the years that followed, their houses became smaller, and Anne never again enjoyed the luxury of servants. We can't know what Anne thought of her slide back down towards poverty, or if the recklessness had been hers all along. That is, until a final piece of evidence gives Anne Dawson a voice. Until now, the rights of most married women in Britain to own and pass on property had been severely restricted. But in 1882, the Married Women's Property Act meant that any woman who could pay the legal fees could make a will and decide what happened to her money. Just 8 weeks after that new law came into effect, Anne visited a lawyer. This document is the last will and testament of Anne Dawson. Now, Anne doesn't have a great deal of money to leave behind, £56. And it's very difficult to translate that sum into a modern equivalent, but it is several £1,000s, and yet that's a tiny amount compared to the huge sums that Rhodes Dawson had ran up in debts. She stipulates in this will that her husband, the said Rhodes Dawson, will be paid interest arising from the principal. So Rhodes is paid interest on the £56, but he doesn't get his hands on the money itself. And when he dies, Anne determines that it will be given to the children of mine in equal parts. Now, this document represents the only time we ever hear the voice of Anne Dawson herself, and we only get to hear her because there's been a change in the law. And what it sounds like is that she is determined to keep Rhodes away from what money she possesses, and now she's got the legal means to do that. Because Rhodes Dawson had completely wrecked Anne's chances of a comfortable life, and here, in this will, she's trying to ensure that he's not able to damage the prospects of her daughters. Just 2 years later, Anne Dawson died. She lived in lots of addresses across the north of England. But it is hard to believe that many of them left as deep an impression on her as Grosvenor Mount. Supposed to be a symbol of her new middle-class life, instead it came to represent everything that was snatched away. By the mid-1860s, 5 Grosvenor Mount, then still number 3, was ready to pass on to its next inhabitants. Although more of the green spaces had been filled by new houses, Headingley still offered an escape from the dirt and the smoke of industrial Leeds. We can find our next family here in the census of 1871, and what it tells us is that the new head of the household is William Nicholson. He's 62 years old, and he's listed here as being a building contractor. And he lives here with his wife, Sophia, who is 63, and their 3 grown-up daughters. Now, each of them is listed here as being an annuitant. And what that means is that each of them receives an annual allowance. And what that tells us is that this is a family with some serious wealth. And you can see that wealth on display in this. This is the very first photograph we've found of anyone who has ever lived in this house. And here is William Nicholson, the building contractor, very clearly a wealthy man with his top hat and his cane. So who was William Nicholson, and why were his family moving to Grosvenor Mount? Luckily for us, there are lots of clues, not in documents, but in the fabric of Leeds itself. County Arcade is one of the architectural masterpieces of Victorian Leeds, and it was built by William Nicholson's company. Inside I'm meeting Rachel Unsworth, an expert on the history of Central Leeds, who we've asked to research William's early life. Tell me about William Nicholson. How did he come to create this family company?
He was a young man from the North Riding of Yorkshire, trained in the family business as a wheelwright and joiner. And he made the decision, once he'd completed his apprenticeship, to make that journey from rural to urban, as so many people did during the 19th century. He had his business down just south of the river, really near Leeds Bridge, in the swim of everything, and grew gradually over the years, taking on more men as the business expanded.
William's firm was soon building across Leeds and beyond. For an ambitious builder, the timing was perfect. Victorian towns were booming and keen to show off their status and their wealth. The Nicholsons built everything from banks to railway stations to churches. The records tell us that William was a hands-on boss, spending months on site alongside his workers.
I think he was organised, determined, trustworthy. I think that's what we find with the people who succeed in the long term. People with very little formal education, but if they were bright and dedicated, you know, they could learn these new skills, new techniques, and knew that they had to in order to survive and thrive and build a little empire to pass on to the next generation.
The next generation was soon waiting in the wings. In 1828, William had married Sophia Marshall. A daughter, also named Sophia, followed in 1833. Then came a son and heir, William Nicholson II, born in 1836. Over the next decade, the couple had a further 4 children. But we've discovered that as young parents, William and Sophia experienced a terrible tragedy. Their growing family lived close to their workshop in central Leeds. For the boys, this was the perfect place to learn the family trade. But it also had dangers. From September 1847, we found a newspaper report about the couple's youngest son, 5-year-old John. John had been playing with some friends in the part of the workshop where wood was cut, and this newspaper report tells us what happened next. On Saturday morning, it says, some shavings had been set on fire opposite John's father's shop on South Brook Street. He and some other lads went to play near the place and amused themselves by flinging bricks among the shavings, which were still smouldering. One of his companions, in a joke, pushed John upon the shavings, and by this means his clothes became ignited. He was so severely burnt that he died the same evening. The workshop had given William his success, but it had come at a terrible personal cost. After the tragic loss of John, William's 2 surviving sons grew up, with William II joining the family firm. So it was when William I reached his 50s that he decided it was time to leave the crowds, the noise, and perhaps the painful memories of the inner city and find a secure home for his family. And soon there was some good news for William and Sophia Nicholson. This is a baptism record from around a year after they moved into this house, and it tells us of the birth of a baby boy. This is a grandson to William and Sophia, and inevitably he's named William. So this is William Nicholson III. So this is a growing family. They're planning for the future, the younger generations emerging, ready to take on the family business when the time is right. William Nicholson lived for another 14 years. By the time he died in 1879, he'd gone from a rural joiner and wheelwright to a prosperous master builder who'd helped shape industrial Leeds. But what became of the dynasty he'd worked so hard to build? William Nicholson II proved to be just as ambitious and talented as his father. Soon the firm was building bigger and bigger, its reputation growing across Britain. But in 1885, they made the press for a different reason. William II was on holiday with his family when he died suddenly from heart disease. He was just 49. Everything about the Nicholsons suggests that they were careful and cautious. They'd built up a family business over decades, and they had meticulously prepared and trained William Nicholson II to take over. But now, all of that foresight, all of that planning, along with all of those decades of experience, have been wiped away. And this is a company that's relatively large, it's well respected. There are dozens of workers and their families who depend upon it for their livelihoods. The person this family had presumed would one day take over, decades in the future, was William Nicholson III. And at his father's death, he is now just 20 years old. The sudden death of a leader often spelt trouble or collapse for Victorian companies. Could the young William III protect the legacy of his father and grandfather? We found this page of the Leeds Mercury. It's dated January 14th, 1892, so 6 months after William III has taken over the family company. And this story here tells us that Nicholson and Son were then building a new bank in the centre of Leeds. And this is proof that Nicholson and Son, under William III, are still capable of building these grand public buildings, just as the company had been under William's father and under his grandfather. But on the same page of the same newspaper, there's another story. And the very first line of this report describes a fire the like of which has never before been witnessed in Leeds. And what we've discovered is a really remarkable connection between this disaster which has befallen Leeds and the story of the young William Nicholson. Deep in the subterranean heart of Leeds is a vast web of tunnels. They are called the Dark Arches and were built in the 1860s to allow river waters to flow directly beneath one of the town's major train stations. Crammed in among the arches were dozens of warehouses, some filled with thousands of tons of tallow, resin, and other highly flammable materials. In the early hours of the 13th of January, 1892, a caretaker saw flames leaping out of a warehouse. The arches under the station were soon a mass of fire. When one platform collapsed, a fireman fell into the flames and was burnt to death. In the intense heat, a vast railway bridge began to crash down into the water below. The bridge had carried lines connecting Leeds to Liverpool, Manchester, and other towns across Britain. In an age before the motorways, the loss of even a single railway line was potentially a disaster. One of the shattered lines was the vital Midland Railway connection to Scotland and the northwest of England. Clearing the wreckage would take weeks. The town had to get this line running sooner. There was one construction company in Leeds with the reputation to do it. But the Nicholsons were now led by a man in his 20s. Could they find a way to get the trains running through the ruins? The young Williams company threw everything at the rescue. 300 men toiled in shifts day and night. And less than 2 weeks after the disaster, there was an announcement in the press. What it reports is that already the Midland Railway Company's scheme for the repair of the damage at Leeds Station has been completed. A wooden trestle bridge had been built. It was 100 yards in length. Now, this bridge that was built about here had to carry the weight of passing trains, and so it was tested. 3 engines were coupled and then taken over at varying rates of speed. The bridge held. And incredibly, the Nicholsons had built it in less than 6 days. What it meant was that the line to Scotland and the north of England could open up once again. This is just 5 months after the young William Nicholson has taken over the family company, and yet, under his leadership, they've been able to come to the assistance of their city. Because of their versatility and their ingenuity, they've been able to help keep the trade and the commerce of Leeds going even after this disastrous fire. After their heroic work at the station, William III's company went on to build some of the town's iconic buildings. And the young William went further than his father or his grandfather, becoming Sir William Nicholson and the Lord Mayor of Leeds. The Nicholsons epitomise the energy and industry of Victorian Britain, as advances in construction and engineering transformed our towns and cities, turning Leeds from a town ringed by fields to the urban centre we know today. And our house played its part in that story. The early residents of this house lived in a Leeds that had transformed itself from a provincial wool town into a great centre of trade and industry. The first of those residents, William Bruce, spent his entire life trying to improve the lives of the people who had driven that great industrial transformation, the workers who toiled in the mills and the factories. Then came Anne Dawson, who started life as one of those mill workers, but transformed herself into the mistress of this house, only for her husband's debts to drag her and her daughters back down the social ladder of Victorian society. Finally, there's William Nicholson I, a joiner from rural Yorkshire, who, despite his lowly origins, despite the tragic loss of a child, created a building dynasty that helped shape the city of Leeds that we know today. All of these lives, lived within the walls of this house, were shaped by the transformations that were taking place within Leeds, a city whose continuing evolution is going to shape the lives of the next residents of number 5 Grosvenor Mount. As the Nicholsons depart, our house is ready for its next family. Benjamin Wilde is a prosperous factory owner, moving in with his wife Hannah and their 3 children. Next time, Wilde's business runs into trouble. It is suspected that the fire is the work of an arsonist. One resident is embroiled in a propaganda war. It's dangerous, isn't it?
These are scary times for Quakers who oppose the war.
And one young man leaves the house at Grosvenor Mount for a life at sea.
Here was this lad from Leeds suddenly mixing with the most swish people in the universe.